All right, class. This live stream is coming at you Sunday night. Um, it deals with Reconstruction, which is a period from 1865 to 1877. It's following the Civil War, and it's all about the rebuilding of the United States. So there's a couple things that you should have done before you went to this video. Number one, you should have gotten the handouts on Reconstruction. This is just a very, very, very brief overview of some of the main points of Reconstruction, some of the key terms and key people. You are definitely going to have to add to that. That's where these notes come in. The second thing that you should have done is that you should have gotten the other handout for the writing assignment that's going to come after these notes. So I've given you five roles to choose from. Each person or character that you're able to choose from has a basic background or biography with them. And we want to keep in the spirit of what we've been doing ever since the 1850s and the decade of crisis. We want to remain in the spirit of the fact that history is human, and putting yourselves in the shoes or in the lives of the people that actually experienced this. It wasn't the past to them; it was the present. So their emotions, their prejudices, their priorities, their goals, their fears are all very real to them. These qualities, these characteristics, these attitudes make up and influence their decisions that they make, the positions that they take in this very, very crucial time in American history. And we're looking at, allowing your person to write a position speech. And we'll talk about that towards the end of class today, at the beginning of class on the second day of this lesson. But writing a position speech, using evidence, um, staking out clear positions and claims, and using evidence to support your position on a couple key issues. But before we get started, I want you to, with the notes and everything, I want you to look at the handout that I've given you that has a brief overview of Reconstruction. Using your person's personality, I want you to answer the four questions that I have at the very top of the handout in the vein or in the attitude, the spirit of the character that you've assumed. For instance, number one, under what conditions should the South be allowed back to the Union? You want to answer that question as your person. We want to do this before we have any knowledge of what Reconstruction is actually going to entail. I also want you to come up with some hypothetical problems that might arise out of your plan. So, for instance, once again, number one, under what conditions should the South be allowed back into the Union? I need that completely answered, and I need you to be able to articulate and hypothesize what potential problems might arise out of your plan for admitting the South back into the Union. I need you to do the same thing for number two, number three, and number four. Once again, this is all in the limited knowledge that you have of your person. Please press pause on this video as you write this down on your sheet of notebook paper. We want to do this so we can start gaining an idea of how our person acts, what our person might think about the actual events that unfold during this time in American history. So this is kind of getting you into the mood of the assignment. Now that's the purpose. So once again, if you haven't already, press pause. All right, now that you're back, there's a couple things here. I want you to have your handout that has a brief overview of Reconstruction. And then I want you to also have that sheet of paper out that you've already jotted down your four answers to those questions that I have at the very top. I'm going to bring your attention to some of these things in the handout. And I'm also going to expect that you answer these questions on that separate sheet of paper. There's going to be some times where I feel like you might be able to just summarize the question, and I've tried to make the answer short and concise. And other times I feel like it's going to be best that you copy straight from the butcher paper. I'm going to go over everything. So, I know that it's not the best as far as the site goes, but if you listen carefully, you should be able to get all the information. All right, so Reconstruction is a time that that follows the Civil War. It's going to last from 1865 to 1877. Something to think about here, and I think I really want to start with this, is that that first paragraph under those numbered questions in your handout. This is going to answer the first three questions that we're going to talk about. After the military conflict had ended, Robert E. Lee surrenders to Ulysses S. Grant in April 9th, 1865 at Appomattox Courthouse. But Reconstruction, this is in many ways still a war. I really want you to underline or highlight a couple of these groups here. The second sentence, this was an important struggle that was waged by radical Northerners who wanted to punish the South. I want you to underline that, radical Northerners who wanted to punish the South. These people will be known as radical Republicans. And then the other group, Southerners, who desperately wanted to preserve the way of life. I want you to underline the Southerners and preserve the way of life. These will probably be the two groups into which your characters might be able to be categorized into. And then you have a third group. Third group is the presidents, Lincoln and Johnson. Lincoln and Johnson, they kind of straddle the line between the radical Republicans and the white Southerners. So Lincoln, even before the Civil War is actually officially over, Lincoln already has an idea of how he wants to reunite this nation. He has a hope. His whole goal throughout the Civil War is to preserve the Union. And so his plan was to make the South's return as quick and as easy as possible. It's a very lenient plan. So what was Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction? It's a very lenient plan. And I know I misspelled lenient. In fact, that he outlines this, or he has a spirit of this in his second inaugural address in March of 1865. He says, he ends his speech, with malice towards none, with charity for all. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle and for his widow and orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations, with malice toward none and charity for all. I think that line right there really speaks to how Lincoln's going to approach this Reconstruction plan. Lincoln's plan is known as the 10% plan. How do we get this? Lincoln says that as soon as 10% of those on the 1860 voting list took an oath of allegiance to the Constitution, the states could form a new state government and send representatives and senators back to Congress. Why does he pick 1860? If you recall, 1860 was the last year that the South actually took part in an election. This was the first election of Abraham Lincoln. And remember, after 1860, when Lincoln gets elected, we have the first 7 states, the lower South. They're going to secede from the Union. Unfortunately for the South, what happens to Lincoln? April 14th, 1865, he's assassinated by a Southerner. He's assassinated at Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth. This is really unfortunate for the South, because now it's up in the air between Congress, these radical Republicans, and Andrew Johnson, who we'll talk about here in a little bit. Under Lincoln's terms, 4 states moved towards readmission into the Union. But even when he was alive, Lincoln was having trouble with members of his own party, namely these radical Republicans. And in July of 1864, once again, this is happening before the Civil War is actually over, the Republicans had proposed something called a Wade-Davis bill, or the Wade-Davis bill. This does a couple of things. Number one, This is the radical Republicans' response to Lincoln and his whole, his whole 10% plan. Number two, it says that the Congress, not the president, but the Congress will be responsible for Reconstruction. Number three, it says that the state government needed a majority, not just 10%, but a majority of 1860 voters to take the loyalty oath. And then what happens is this way, Davis bill, Lincoln used something known as the pocket veto, which is this last part right here, to kill the bill. Basically, it says that the pocket veto is if Congress is out of session and the president doesn't sign a bill into law after so many days, it automatically becomes vetoed. This whole spirit of the Wade Davis bill speaks to those Republicans that wanted to punish the South. They wanted to take away all political power of those former Southern slave owners, and they wanted to give the African Americans the vote. They wanted to give the African Americans full citizenship. They want to give the African Americans land. So we want to remember that as we move forward, that even before Lincoln gets assassinated, that he's already having problems with members of his own party. So now that Lincoln is assassinated, let's move on. His vice president, a man that was born in North Carolina, Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson is going to become president. Now, Andrew Johnson, he's weird. He's an enemy of Southern planters. He's an enemy of those rich Southern slave owners. He was one of the only Southerners to stay with the Union. This is why Lincoln nominates him or gets him to be his vice president in 1864. And so a lot of these radical Republicans believed that he was somebody that they could work with, but they were wrong. In May of 1865, the month after Lincoln gets assassinated, Johnson announced his own plan to reconstruct the 7 remaining Confederate states that hadn't moved towards readmission under Lincoln's 10% plan. And so this question I have in a T chart, and I really think that this would be the best way to take notes on this question. It says, how did the views of Lincoln and Johnson differ from the views of the radical Republicans? And so on the left-hand side, I have Lincoln and Johnson's plans. Both Lincoln and Johnson wanted to make the South's return as quick as possible. Once again, very lenient. Johnson, these next bullets here are really specific to Andrew Johnson's plan of presidential reconstruction. This is in your handout, and so I'm going to kind of go into a little bit more depth of this idea known as presidential reconstruction, which lasts from 1865 to 1867. Johnson says that the states to move back towards being readmitted into the Union, they need to declare secession illegal. They need to swear loyalty and allegiance to the Constitution, and they need to ratify the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. After they did these, they could be readmitted back into the Union. Johnson, a couple other things that we want to remember about him is that Johnson, he pardons 13,000 former Confederate officials. So this is going to allow them to get the right to vote back, and to gain some political power back that was going to be originally taken away from them. Johnson also believes in the idea of states' rights. He believes that the southern states, instead of a strong central government, should be the ones that are really taking hold of what to do with the African Americans, the 4.5 million freed slaves, and how to set up their own state governments after Reconstruction. So he's a strong believer in states' rights over a strong central government. And he also is a racist. He believes that African Americans should not vote. And so the remaining ex-Confederate states quickly agreed to Johnson's terms, and within a few months, these states held conventions, they drew up state constitutions, they set up new state governments, they elected representatives to Congress. And this is going to be at odds with these Republicans, those radical Republicans, those Northerners, led by a man named Thaddeus Stevens. In contrast to Lincoln and Jefferson, the radical Republicans want to punish the South. They want to destroy the political power of the former slave owners. They believe that African Americans should get the full citizenship rights and the right to vote. And they believe that African Americans need land, they need voting rights, and they need equal protection under the law. And so we already see here in 1865 that there's going to be a conflict. There's going to be a clash between Andrew Johnson and supporters of presidential reconstruction, which is a little bit more lenient, and those who believe that the power of Reconstruction should lie with Congress and the radical Republicans, and bring on harsher terms for the South. Before they're able to fully be readmitted back into the Union. So what happens here between Congress and Johnson? Well, there's a couple key items here, key pieces of the legislation that happened in 1865 and 1866 that I feel like are going to be relevant to your eventual position paper. Either these are things that your person would be really for, and in favor for, you might want to include that as a positive, or these are some things that you might want to take and spin as a negative, depending on what they are and what they do, where they place the power, and then also how they affect Southern whites, how do they affect African Americans. So on and so forth. So we need to identify three terms here that are relevant to the years 1865 to 1866. The first one is the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau is the first major act. It was passed by Congress in 1865, the month before the war ended, and it's going to last through 1866. The Freedmen's Bureau offered assistance. This is medical assistance. This is educational assistance. This is food and clothing to freed slaves and poor whites. In 1866, Congress votes to expand it. Andrew Johnson vetoes this expansion of the Freedmen's Bureau, but Congress will override Andrew Johnson's veto and pass it anyway. Some results here from the Freedmen's Bureau as far as what they did. 40 hospitals were created by the Freedmen's Bureau. They distributed clothing and food. They set up more than 4,000 primary schools in the South. They set up 61 industrial institutes, so they're trying to move the South to a more diversified economy and get away from cotton. And they set up 74 teacher training establishments because at the same time they're promoting public education for the first time in the South. The second item here that we want to identify is going to be the first Civil Rights Act ever passed in our country's history. And it's the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Once again, this will be vetoed by Andrew Johnson, but Congress will override this veto. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 is also going to go hand in hand with the 14th Amendment, which provided full citizenship, equal protection on the laws, regardless of race, into the Constitution. So the Civil Rights Act of 1866, it gave African Americans citizenship and forbade states from passing discriminatory laws. Once again, Andrew Johnson vetoes this, and Congress overrides this veto, and also makes it constitutional by passing the 14th Amendment. So why in 1866 does Congress feel like this is necessary? Well, it's because the last term here on this sheet, there's something called the Black Codes. When under Johnson's plan, giving power back to the state governments so they could decide how they wanted blacks to be treated, pardoning those Confederate officials, allowing some of those same politicians that were in power before the war resume their power after the war. You saw the establishment of these things called black codes in these southern states. And black codes are essentially these laws that restored many of the restrictions of slavery back on the African Americans. A couple things that the black codes did. They prohibited blacks from carrying weapons. Black codes prohibited blacks from serving on juries. Black codes prohibited blacks from testifying against whites, from marrying whites, from starting their own business, and from traveling without permits. So essentially, under Johnson's plan and presidential Reconstruction, for the first year or so, nothing really changes for these newly freed people, these 4.5 million freed slaves. Life is essentially the same, and they still have the same restrictions. Just without the label or the institution of slavery being official. And so this is the impetus for the Civil Rights Act, or this is the cause for the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And so you're going to see these Republicans in the North who want to punish the South and do all these things. You're going to start to see them add in those constitutional amendments. They've already passed the 13th Amendment. They've ratified and passed the 14th Amendment. And then in 1868, they'll get the 15th Amendment passed, which will grant the right to vote for African American males. These amendments that I've been talking about, 13th, 14th, and 15th, on the second lecture, 1867 through 1877, eventually that all of these amendments are going to become a requirement for southern states to be readmitted back to the Union. And something to think about here when we're looking at the legacy of Reconstruction, these are one of the positive steps towards racial equality. Why are we learning this? I've talked about we're going to look at the evolution of the word and the idea of equality. I would think that the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the Freedmen's Bureau, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, these are things that are being put into place at our time in our history that's really changing people's idea of what equality means and what equality looks like. However, there's still a lot of room to grow, both today and back here during Reconstruction. So a couple things here that we want to look at as we end our lecture for today, and I'll get you started on your writing assignment. Is I felt like it was relevant to talk about Southern society during Reconstruction, and how are we reconstructing society in the South. And so there's a couple key things that we want to look at. Now, once again, I think that it would be best that you put these things in a bubble chart, bubble map. If you want to do something else, that's fine. However, I really would encourage you guys to do it in a bubble map. So a couple of things that we want to look at for society in the South during this time, and this is not really on your handout. So once again, it's really important that you take notes and that you're listening here. I'm going to start with conditions in the post-war South. Then I'm going to go to politics in post-war South. We'll look at the freedmen and how they improved their lives during Reconstruction, and then we'll come back up here to changes in the Southern economy. So conditions in the post-war South. Something that we need to remember, and you probably were made aware of this, or you came to this realization as you were doing your Civil War guided notes, is that most of the Civil War was fought on Southern soil, and so many of these new Southern state governments faced a challenge of having to physically rebuild this battle-scarred region. To give you like an example of how bad it was, William Tecumseh Sherman, he estimated that his troops alone had destroyed about $100 million worth of Confederate property in Georgia and South Carolina. You remember Sherman was the one that captured Atlanta and then went through that march to the sea from Atlanta to Savannah and then moved up through South Carolina. So through that march to the sea and then up through South Carolina, destroying $100 million of property. Another thing to think about here with conditions in the post-war South is that we saw 20% of Southern white males have died from the war. We have tens of thousands of African Americans, both men and women. They had died as well, either fighting for the Union, working in Confederate labor camps. Women and children, both white and black, who stayed home, they suffered from malnutrition. They suffered from illnesses. We saw that because of the destruction of Southern property, because of the destruction of cotton as a basis for the economy, property value went down in the South. For instance, the wealth per capita among whites in Alabama, for instance, dropped from about $18,000 in 1860 to about $3,000 in 1870. So in a decade, right? You saw that the wealth of of Southerners and Southern whites, it was worth about a uh, a sixth, right, of what it was before. Another thing that we have to look at is that so how are we going to rebuild this post-war South, and how are we going to start to introduce some of these institutions that the North had but the South didn't? So these Republican governments, as they were taking control or being voted into the South, or as Congress started to institute more control over Reconstruction, they started something called a public works program. And so public works, you're trying to repair the physical damage, you're trying to provide social services. So under this public works program, governments built roads, bridges, railroads. They established orphanages. They created institutions for the care of the mentally ill and disabled. They created the first public schools. To do this, though, and this is the downside, to actually get these public work programs up and running, state governments grew larger and they spent more money than they had before the war. And where do governments get money? Well, to raise money, most southern states increase poll taxes, they increase property taxes, they increase sales taxes. And so between 1860 and 1870, taxes in the South almost tripled. So, you see this financial crisis happening in the South. And really, it's just an overall crisis that's really going to set them back. Physically, the land is destroyed. The population is destroyed. The property value is destroyed. And even when you're trying to do some good things like bringing in schools, roads, bridges, railroads, whatnot, to pay for it, right? That's only going to increase or to exacerbate the struggle. And so it's really like a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation here for the South, and they're going to continue to struggle even into the 20th century. So moving to the next category here, politics in the post-war South. So a couple things that we want to look at here in 1865, 1866. The next day's lesson will focus on some other things. So we have two or three groups of people that are making up the Republican Party in the South. We have scallywags, we have carpetbaggers, and then we have African Americans. So scallywags are white Southerners that joined the Republican Party. They wanted the South to industrialize as quickly as possible, and they believed that this could be done best under a Republican government. Most of these are small farmers. They wanted to improve their economic position. If you're a white Southerner that joined the Republican Party, you probably didn't have a lot of money to begin with. You're probably a little envious or jealous, maybe, of those white Southern plantation owners who had all the political and economic power. So this is your chance to move up the ladder. So scalawags are one group of people that voted Republican during Reconstruction. The other group of people are carpetbaggers. These are Northerners who moved south after the war. This is a negative name because they arrived with really not a lot of belongings, and they carried everything in this small traveling bag that was made of carpeting, hence the name carpetbaggers. They had some mixed motives. Some of these carpetbaggers are with the Freedmen's Bureau, so they're teachers, they're ministers, and they felt like it was a moral duty to help out the former slaves. Others were Union soldiers who wanted to buy land, or they were business people who wanted to take advantage of this opportunity to start up a new industry or a factory down south at a cheap price. And then the third block of voters would be African Americans. So African Americans are gaining voting rights as a result of the 15th Amendment. And during Reconstruction, African American men, 8 out of 10 African American men that that registered to vote supported the Republican Party. And in many areas, almost 90% of the qualified African American voters voted. And so you have heavy turnout by African American men. 90% of them are going to actually vote, and then 8 out of 10 of them are going to vote the Republican Party. However, because these are three very distinct and different groups of people, and they all have different motives, you're going to see a lot of conflicting goals here, and that's ultimately going to bring and some other things that we'll talk about in the next lecture, but that'll ultimately bring a downfall to the Republican Party in the South for the time being, and you're going to see the Southern Democratic Party come back up to prominence again. The last thing that we want to talk about with society and Reconstruction would be freedmen and how they improve in their lives. So a couple things that we want to talk about. The majority of freed African Americans moved. But they were really eager to leave plantations that they associated with the oppression of the slave system, and they moved to southern towns and cities where they could find jobs. And just a quick statistic here, between 1865 and 1870, the African American population of the 10 largest southern cities doubled. So you're seeing a lot of them, freedmen moving off the farm if they're able to, and we'll talk about that in a little bit here, and moving to the cities where they can find other jobs. You see an increased emphasis on education with the former slaves, because slaves, if we remember, they had been punished if they tried to learn how to read and write. More than 90% of the freed African Americans over the age of 20 were illiterate in 1870. So there's a strong push with the Freedmen's Bureau, African American churches, Northern Charitable Organization, state governments who were pushing for those public schools, to have African Americans organize their own schools, colleges, universities. This is when you see Shaw, St. Aug, Hampton Institute in Hampton, Virginia. This is when these schools and universities are being built and being created. In fact, by 1870, so the Civil War ends in 1865, in just 5 years, African Americans had spent more than $1 million on education. And by 1877, when Reconstruction is over, more than 600,000, or more than 500,000 African Americans were enrolled in elementary schools. So you can see here that definitely a big push to improve your lives. The other thing that we see here as far as how freedmen improved their lives during Reconstruction is with churches. During slavery, slaves had their own praise meetings. They had their own religious gatherings, featuring singing and preaching by self-taught slave preachers. If you remember, Nat Turner could be an example of this from the early 19th century. And so after the war, we see many African Americans establish their own churches. Most of them are going to be Baptist or Methodist, and they started to hold services similar to these early praise meetings. We see that this is so important because this is like the one institution that African Americans fully controlled. And so you didn't really see the assistance or the collaboration with whites when it comes to churches. And as a result of this, the people at the head of the churches, the ministers, right, they played a really important and influential role in African American communities, and then later, this broader role when it comes into politics. Another way that African Americans improve their lives is that you started to see them get politically active. So we had this last one right here, blacks in Reconstruction. And so we started to see African Americans get involved in politics. And so we see from 1865 to 1877, during this time of Reconstruction, growing African American involvement in politics at all levels, the local level, with cities, the state level, and the federal government. At first, most of these African Americans that were getting involved in politics were born free, but by 1867, you started to see former slaves also get politically active. Even though that in the South there were more black voters than white voters in the South, African American office holders remained in the minority. Only in South Carolina was there a black majority in the state legislature. No Southern state elected an African American governor during this time, and out of the 125 Southerners that were elected to the U.S. Congress during this period of congressional reconstruction, only 16 of them were African Americans. So even though we started to see African Americans get politically active in this short time period right after the Civil War during Reconstruction, and even though they held the majority as far as voters go in these states and in these cities, the progress still was slow as far as seeing actual people, or actual people, African Americans, former slaves that were elected into office. The last thing we want to talk about with reconstructing society would be changes in the Southern economy. We're going to talk about three things here: the idea of 40 acres and a mule, sharecropping and tenant farming, and then no more King Cotton. So this idea of 40 acres and a mule came in January of 1865. Once again, General William Tecumseh Sherman, he promised to freed slaves who followed his army 40 acres per family and the use of army mules. As a result, we see about 40,000 freed persons settle on 400,000 acres in coastal Georgia and South Carolina. Some of this land had been abandoned, and others it was seized by the government from these planters who had supported the Confederacy. However, this is short-lived, this idea of 40 acres and a mule, because in August of 1865, President Johnson ordered that the original landowners be allowed to reclaim their land and evict or kick out the former slaves. And so, as you see, as a result of President Johnson ending this 40 acres and a mule program, you see a lot of the planters who went back to farming, and a lot of the African Americans they turned to this system called sharecropping or tenant farming, and they're slightly different here. Sharecropping, the system of sharecropping is that the landowners divided their land and gave each worker. This could be a freed African American or a poor white. So they divided the land up and they gave each worker a few acres. And this landowner under sharecropping also gave them tools and seed. When the crops were harvested, each worker gave a share of his crops. This is usually about half of his crops back to the landowner. And he also paid the owner back for any seed that he had, the tools that he used. Unfortunately, though, with sharecropping, what you gave back and the money that you gave back from selling your crop and stuff, you were still in debt. So the next year you had to go back and you had to work for the same person, and then after that you were still in debt, probably a little bit more in debt, and then the cycle starts. So instead of you see with sharecropping, it's like a form of like economic slavery, and so you're always in debt to the same person, and so therefore you always have to work for them on their land, right? Tenant farming is slightly different. Tenant farming, you own your own horses, you own your own tools, and you rent the land for cash. And so essentially, tenant farming, you have all the necessary supplies. You're just renting the land to use, and then whatever the rent is, you pay them back. So it's a little bit better, and there's there's a slim possibility that you might be able to move up the economic ladder under tenant farming. Sharecropping, though, is basically this whole cycle of debt, poverty, and essentially economic slavery. The last change that we want to see in the Southern economy is that cotton's no longer king. The prices dropped. Great Britain had found another source for cotton for their textile mills, India. So India replaced the South as far as being the big cotton supplier. And so all these problems, you started to see the South try to diversify their economy. You started to see textile mills spring up. And you also started to see tobacco products being manufactured in the South. And so there's a slight shift here, but for the most part, the South, because of all these problems, they're going to remain pretty. It's a pretty depressed region well into the 20th century. Um, so let's to recap. You you got accustomed to who you were, the character that you were playing at the very beginning. When I asked you to answer those 4 questions in the mood of your person based on what you know. Now you have an idea of Reconstruction from 1865 to the end of 1866. I've given you some stuff that might bleed over into 1867, 1868, but I still think that you can use this information, and it's still going to be relevant with the time of your paper, the end of 1866. Your next step, now that you've gathered research from the notes, your next step is to collect the reading source, or the primary source that I've given you, or the primary sources, I should say, that I've given you that are associated with your reader. You want to read through those sources, and you want to pull out or root out evidence, claims, statistics, phrases, all right, that would highlight your character's position on that particular issue. So basically, you've gathered historical evidence and historical research through notes in this lecture, and now your next step will be to gain historical research and evidence through the reading and the note taken of your primary sources. When you're done with this and you start moving towards the sources, I have the sources. They are a class set, so you have to keep them with me. And if you have any questions about the instructions for what you need to do with your primary sources, they're on that handout, and of course you can ask me. After you finish your research, you're ready to start the brainstorming and outlining process for your position paper, and then finally you're able to start writing it. Once again, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask, and I hope that this has been beneficial for you.